For hundreds of thousands of years, human biology optimized itself for one specific environment: flat, stable ground under a constant 1g force of gravity. But step off the Earth and into a cockpit, and you enter a three-dimensional domain of shifting accelerations and featureless weather. Every sensor in your body, and the circulatory system pumping blood to your brain, evolved to operate within the strict physical constraints of that terrestrial baseline. Strap that ground-optimized biology into an aircraft, the sudden shift in physics breaks those sensory mechanisms. The result is a series of systematic, predictable physiological failures. In flight, your primary sensors actively generate false telemetry, feeding the brain fabricated data about your speed, pitch, and bank angle. Surviving instrument flight requires a learned discipline. You must recognize these biological signals, deliberately override them, and trust the mechanical instrumentation on the panel in front of you. Spatial awareness relies on two primary biological systems: the visual data coming through your eyes, and the vestibular apparatus located deep inside your inner ear. On the ground, the inner ear acts as a secondary backup. It constantly detects small shifts in balance, but the brain immediately cross-references and corrects that data against the dominant visual horizon. But when an aircraft flies into thick clouds or operates at night, that external visual reference vanishes entirely. Stripped of optical data, the brain elevates the inner ear's vestibular telemetry to its primary source of orientation. The inner ear was never designed to process sustained three-dimensional motion. Relying on this backup sensor without visual confirmation is the exact mechanical trigger for spatial disorientation. Inside the vestibular apparatus are three semicircular canals. Because they are arranged at right angles to each other, they can detect angular acceleration across all three axes: pitch, roll, and yaw. When your head begins to rotate, the viscous fluid inside these canals initially lags behind due to inertia. This lagging fluid bends a cluster of fine sensory hairs at the base of the canal, signaling rotation to the brain. That system works perfectly for the short, sudden movements of terrestrial life. But the physics change when an aircraft rolls into a prolonged, steady banked turn. As the turn holds steady, the fluid's inertia is overcome. It accelerates until it matches the speed of the canal walls. Without that speed difference, the fluid stops pushing against the sensory hairs, and they return to a neutral position. The nerve endings stop firing. Even though the aircraft is continuously banking and turning, your brain receives zero rotational telemetry. You physically feel as though you are flying perfectly level. When you eventually roll the aircraft back to level flight, the physical rotation stops, but the fluid's momentum keeps it moving inside the canal, bending the sensory hairs in the opposite direction. Your aircraft is now flying perfectly straight, but your inner ear signals that you are rapidly rolling into a brand new turn. This is the leans, the sensation of a roll that isn't actually happening. While the semicircular canals handle rotation, the otolithic organ, or utricle, senses gravity and linear acceleration. It relies on a gelatinous membrane studded with tiny calcium carbonate crystals, acting as pendulous weights. When you tilt your head back, gravity pulls these weights downward along the membrane, bending the sensory hairs and sending a pitch-up signal to the brain. Consider the effect of rapid forward linear acceleration, such as the force felt during takeoff. As the aircraft accelerates forward, inertia causes those heavy crystals to lag backward. This bends the sensory hairs in the exact same direction as tilting your head back. Mechanically, the brain receives identical telemetry for both an upward pitch and a forward linear acceleration. Without a clear visual horizon to correct this data, accelerating into the dark convinces the brain that the nose is pitched dangerously high. The pilot instinctively pushes the nose down, potentially driving the aircraft into the ground. Even the visual system is vulnerable. The visual cortex relies on stored geometric templates to judge depth and distance from the ground. A standard flat runway viewed from a 3-degree glide path creates a specific trapezoidal shape. The brain uses this familiar perspective to confirm the aircraft is on the correct trajectory. If a runway is built on an upslope, the geometry changes. The far end sits higher than the threshold, which mimics the optical perspective of an aircraft flying too high. Trusting that cue, a pilot instinctively reduces power and steepens the descent to recapture the correct optical picture. By correcting a false high indication, they fly a dangerously low approach. A runway that is narrower than standard creates a similar error. It appears much smaller than the brain expects, creating the illusion that the aircraft is higher and more distant than its actual position. Because the visual cortex relies on these rigid geometric assumptions, non-standard terrain automatically spoofs the processor into making hazardous trajectory corrections. Beyond the geometry of the runway, the surrounding environment can induce a black hole approach. The human brain calculates absolute distance by triangulating background texture and peripheral references. Approaching an airfield over unlit water or remote desert at night removes this peripheral texture. There are no city lights and no visible horizon. Stripped of contextual clues, the visual processor miscalculates the void. It interprets the runway lights as floating far below, creating the illusion that the aircraft is at a much higher altitude. Without texture to anchor the visual calculations, the pilot feels compelled to sink into the dark abyss, flying a shallow, dangerously low approach path. These illusions are processing errors, but the physical forces of flight can also degrade the hardware of the eye in real time. To maintain their spherical shape, the eyes require constant positive internal pressure. Positive load factor, or G-force, multiplication occurs during steep turns or pitches. This increases the effective weight of every component in the aircraft, including the pilot's blood. As load factor increases into the 3.5 to 4.5 G range, the blood becomes heavy. The heart struggles to pump it upward, and the blood pressure in the head drops rapidly. Because the eyes are maintaining their internal pressure, the weakened flow cannot push oxygenated blood into the retina. The sensors shut down sequentially, first gray out, then tunnel vision, and finally total blackout. G-forces act as a direct physical throttle on the visual processor, systematically shutting down sight before the brain itself loses consciousness. These localized sensory failures, the fluid lag, the optical illusions, and the circulatory strain, ultimately converge on the brain. A pilot operates on a continuous control loop of stimulation, perception, analysis, and action. However, the brain functions as a single-channel processor, handling one conscious decision at a time. When vestibular errors, geometric optical spoofing, and circulatory strain occur simultaneously, they flood that pipeline. These conflicting streams of false biological telemetry overwhelm the analysis phase, destroying the pilot's situational awareness. True situational awareness requires an active cognitive defense against this biological overload. To break the illusion, you have to sever the incoming biological data. You must immediately shift your focus entirely inside the cockpit and anchor your mind to the artificial horizon. Mastering instrument flight is a rigorous exercise in cognitive discipline, accepting that your biology will lie to you and trusting your life to the mechanics of the machine.